Okay, on the show today, David Emerson. I could call him a trauma sensitive yoga teacher, but that would be understating it. He kind of more or less invented the term, as far as I can tell. Co-director of the Center for Trauma and Embodiment in 2002. So this is, quite far back in this world. He co-founded the Trauma Center for Trauma Center for Trauma Sensitive Yoga. There we go. Associated with Bezel van der Kolk, I believe, and just done loads of good work in areas with, with veterans, with different survivors of different things, and bit of a legend actually. So, David, welcome.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it.
Let's hear a bit about your life story. How did whatever happened to you get you into what you do now?
Interesting. Yeah. So, where to start? I mean, just from like a professional scope, I was going down the path to become a therapist. Had right after college, did some frontline social work, worked with youth, things like that. 30 years ago, really never heard the word trauma, to be honest. But now that I look back, we were working with kids with complex trauma. So for me, after those experiences, it just seemed like for about 10 years, the next path would be to become a clinical care provider. So I went down that route and just found pretty quickly that talking about trauma wasn't comfortable for me. I couldn't figure out how to be helpful using language as the primary way of engaging. So primary way of engaging with somebody seeking care, you know?
Yes.
So for me, and then in my personal life with some traumatic loss, I was engaging with Tai Chi and then yoga for my personal care. Found that being an embodied provider was a little bit more comfortable for me. So I became a yoga teacher in the Western kind of framework, which is it's a whole other topic probably for us and for your listeners. How is yoga showing up here? How does it manifest? I did enjoy some of the physical components and liked offering that to people. But the part of me that was really connected to social work and it turned out, trauma care provision was always there. So it was just, what happened for me was I got a chance to connect the two
Mm, mm.
and just kind of trying to run with it.
I think one thing we share is, did you do a little bit of work with kind of outward bound kind of stuff? We call it outdoor education in the UK. And I remember doing that when I was young, and you see kids who are quite naughty, inverted commas, because often it just means, traumatized, hyperarousal, hypervigilant, just really blossom when we take them into the woods
Yeah.
or do archery or abseiling, and something was going on there. And I'd go, okay, it's not exactly therapy, because I'd had, when I was doing it, just out of a psychology degree, still quite young, but I could see it was really beneficial for them doing something physical.
Yeah.
I think you had some sort of similar experiences, or
Same. The exact program is called Project Adventure here, very similar. But and in our case, yeah, it was like getting out of this scenario, getting out of and wherever you had kind of grown, and these are still young kids, like 10, 11, you've already been identified as a problem in your environment. Again, 30 years ago, didn't talk about trauma at all. And the quality of survivorship, that's really the truth, I think, from my perspective. But they were problematized by the system. Stepping away from that, number one, new environment, and then being able to climb trees and row boats and experience yourself in a different way. Non-verbal in a certain sense, I think that was a benefit. The camaraderie, doing something together, being supported by other people in a certain kind of way, I think that probably had a big part of it. But yeah, really enjoyable and informative for me too.
I know you did Tai Chi. I did a lot of Aikido, and I remember at that stage I didn't want to talk about my feelings. You couldn't drag me to a counselor when I was 18. I wouldn't go.
Yeah.
But there was something very therapeutic about the Aikido and the power and the dynamism and the discipline and the movement. I just know I felt better after doing it, and I would drink less while I was doing Aikido. I was self-medicating less.
Yeah.
And at the moment, I'm taking young guys into the gym to lift weights, and it's brilliant because they don't necessarily similar thing. They don't necessarily want to talk about it, but they know
Yeah.
this felt sense of empowerment that could come from a lot of ventures doing boundary stuff with a guy today. And is that what you discovered sort of in the yoga world, that there was really good stuff in there?
Yeah, I think, yeah, I can relate to that. And just to state, in case we don't get to do it, I benefit so much from talk therapy now. I want to
Hmm.
be clear, like, I feel personally the place for that in my life. Work with lots of colleagues who are talk therapists. But yeah, I think the nonverbal quality of engaging with your body in an intentional way um, was the primary kind of indicator for me. Like that was the main thing. The relationship, the ways that a person can offer yoga, and we also do weightlifting now and theater for youth, the ways you can provide like that relationship between the facilitator and the person seeking care. I learned about that more over time. So the first thing for me was, yeah, there's something to this personal practice of attending to my embodied experience thoughtfully that was beneficial. Now I really do think that the relationship is at least as important
Like,
as the,
for example, the emphasis on choice that you have in trauma sensitive yoga class. I trained with
yeah,
from Canada who years ago who I think had done your work, and I was really struck. It was 10 years ago now, and I was used to sort of disciplinarian Eastern kind of high power distance, they call it in cultural studies, and she was offering all these choices, and I remember being almost confused, but at the same time like, wow, that's a whole different meta learning that I've got choices over my body.
yeah, totally. Yeah, and I think that occurs in the context of the relationship, right? So there's from the facilitator perspective, there's a couple of focal points. One is invitational language, right? So everything we're doing is presented invitationally. Then there's the opportunity for choice making. But at the same time, the facilitator is doing that too. Like to me, so the relationship is not one directional. It's very cyclical. We're both showing up, or however many of us are there. The facilitator is also participating. And that's different. Like that's different than kind of the Western perspective on even, like psychodynamic therapy, where there's somebody who's kind of outside of the system and there's some
Yeah,
benefit to that,
yeah.
right? In these moments, these yoga sessions or these weightlifting sessions, let's say yoga specifically, it's a little different for weightlifting. We're participating too. Like you're engaging in the form. You're making choices in your body in that same moment. You're wondering, you're tending to sensation too. That's what I think I've been learning more and more about over the years is that quality to the relationship where whoever's there, your experience is validated, not because somebody else is validating you per se, but because no one is interfering, like
Mhm.
get to participate, have our experiences, including the facilitator. So in that case, right, my focus is on myself in that way. What's happening for me? I don't need to try to make sense out of what's happening for you for you. I'm turning that over to you. I'm actually like, what's going on here? You
Hmm.
know,
Hmm.
it's a really interesting thing. And at the same time, we're really conscious of boundaries. There's clarity in the relationship, but there's room for that. And it's really interesting.
This is quite advanced already, so maybe let's take a step back. I'm thinking there's different levels of people listening I want to draw in. Um, I think there was a sort of naive view maybe 10 years ago that yoga's good for people with trauma.
Yeah.
It's like, well, not always. Sometimes it's reinforcing body dissociation, it's in reinforcing you powerlessness. When the teacher, I had some very nasty adjustments 10 years ago from yoga teachers who thought they knew better than me about my body. There's power relationships, there's dissociation, there's spiritual bypassing. There's like 4 or 5 ways it might be yoga might be bad. So, what are some of the ways yoga could be really bad for trauma? Let's look at those.
Absolutely. That's so great that you just named all that because 100% right to say yoga is good for trauma. And that is a trap. It's a trap that we have encountered since we started in 2002, right? I would say one quality of that is it's the expert trap. There's somebody who's going to tell you what's good for you, right? Under any circumstances. I think that's a slippery slope, like it's just problematic. What does it mean? I think what we need, what we're making an effort to do here is be thoughtful about the models we're creating, right? Be able to explain them, be transparent about that, so that we can be held accountable. And when someone just says, this is good for you, there's really no accountability necessarily. If you just say this is good for you, you don't have to explain what's underneath it. Just take research, for example. Like, I think we're talking about yoga and trauma. There are a lot of claims made about this thing being good for you with just no empirical evidence for a
Right.
lot of stuff. Not to say that that's the only thing, but we should be able to say why, even if it's like, it's just because I think it's good for you. Well, okay, at least I know what I'm dealing with
Yeah,
now,
some personal experience. Yeah.
right? A lot of
Mm.
people do that. Our work has been, how do we not get involved in that trap? And especially for complex trauma, which we can talk more about, it's an immediate failure. It's like, there's no way you're going to help anybody with deep, complex trauma by claiming that space. Like, I know what's good, just listen to me.
Because of disempowerment, if disempowerment's the nature of almost all trauma, if not all trauma, then as soon as you take that position of power over, no matter how helpful stretching or whatever is, it may be some biochemical side benefit maybe, but the nature of that dynamic has immediately messed it up as a trauma healing.
100%, you nailed it. There's one of the great theorists of complex trauma. Her name's Judith Herman. Always highly recommend the book Trauma and Recovery to anybody. She has a framing, which is no intervention that takes power away from the survivor can possibly foster her recovery, no matter how much it appears to be in her immediate best interest.
Right. Is there another side to this? So I've been extremely happy by seeing the yoga world become more trauma sensitive. Just, because essentially I was being abused in yoga classes, and just as someone that studied it in kind of other areas, I was quite shocked. And the martial arts is, if anything, worse, and dance as well. So I don't want to pick on yoga. But there's been this wonderful movement that you've really led. And I think now the average yoga teacher listening to this would, unless they're really old school Iyengar kind of style, the average yoga teacher now in Germany, England, America anyway, is pretty trauma informed. And some of them are a little trauma deformed. Sort of everything's an invitation. And I
Yeah.
wonder if there's another extreme where where it becomes something is lost. Because that is a kind of liberal position. I say that not in the political sense, but in the philosophical sense, So the sort of liberal philosophical underpinnings of the West. Is there sort of two extremes? One would be like too authoritarian, too kind of abusive in that way. Is it possible to go too far the other way?
I mean, here's where I would say we want to check the dogma of what's happening, right? If I say to somebody, every cue should be invitational, that's a dogma just like anything else. Like, the real point is, what's the purpose? Like, why? Why is that the suggestion? So my one inclination I have is, people might have the idea that being invitational is good for trauma, but they might not know why they're doing it.
Right.
And I think people feel that. Students that show up in a class and someone is just like rattling off invitations, but they don't really hold what's happening there.
Because it can be, I invite you to do this. And you're
Yeah,
like,
it
whoa,
can feel
the energy
aggressive.
is not about consent. This is
Yeah.
command energy, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that happens. So it's probably a factor. We might want to talk together, keep talking together about the why part, you know.
Nice. Nice. Just writing down a couple of bits here. Um, okay, so worst yoga class in the world for trauma, super authoritarian, lots of boundary crossing, lots of body dissociation, maybe very extreme physically, so people really aren't tuning in. I was looking at a meme from a bro weightlifting page yesterday, and they were like, I lift as hard as I can so I can feel as little as possible. And it
But
was
that's a very common sentiment, right? Like,
very honest.
yeah,
Like
very
they were
honest.
saying, like, hey, this helps me emotionally dissociate. They wouldn't know that term because they're a bro, but they got that they felt better emotionally. They described it as like a holiday from their emotions. So not all bad. That's a coping
Yeah,
mechanism, right?
totally. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, we know, no pain, no gain is a mantra that, like, we've probably all been drilled with at some point in our lives or heard. Yeah, no, that idea is really deep. And like you said, but there's something good in there, right? Like, what does that mean? You know, if you can follow that through a little bit, there may be something there, you know?
Conscious dissociation, I think, is not always bad. It's certainly got me through a few days and nights, and it's better I do it with weightlifting than I do it with alcohol or drugs, in my case. So,
Yeah. I was offering a training once, and a participant said she identified herself as a trauma survivor, and she said, "Why do you want to take dissociation away from me?"
right.
It really made me stop. I was like, "Ooh, I must be presenting this in a way wouldn't be my intention. Like, I
Mm,
don't want
mm.
to actually take anything, especially maybe dissociation from anybody." Um, and so I think, like you said, it's probably the most important survival skill for us is with complex trauma, and there's no reason to take anything from anybody.
Right. As
Just
Gabor,
about
Gabor says with drugs and alcohol, like, hey, people need their anesthetic for a reason, right? And
the reason.
what else have you got? You better have an alternative if you're going to open up the
Exactly.
body, right? Because that's
Yeah.
another problem. There's the authoritarian style of yoga that could be problematic, but then there's also just taking people too quickly into feeling, right? When they're not able to self-regulate it, and it's just overwhelming.
Yeah. Right. And I think there's a good amount of evidence, around implicit memory and somatic memory. So our perspective on complex trauma, we do align with the idea that's been played out in some research that most of our trauma memories are somatic. They're in our bodies. And when we encounter them first, they don't have a intellectual analog. There's no thoughts or necessarily. It's body experiences. We start to do stuff with our bodies like this, we're going directly to the source, like where trauma really lives. So yeah, it's very possible for this to be overwhelming. So part of the relationship is that titration, that working together on the amount.
Yeah. I mean, I hear you're a thoughtful guy and a guy who respects evidence base. Let's look at this idea of trauma being in the body because it's become a new dogma, I think,
Yeah.
actually, right? Like I was pushing that idea 20 years ago and people were like, what? And now I hear it almost pushed to, I say, what do you mean? Is it that the nervous system's set to a kind of fight flight default, that there's numbing? And then masseuses, for example, massage people I know will say, hey, I massage a certain muscle and a certain memory comes out, so they're much more specific. If we say trauma is in the body as opposed to done and in the body, what would be your understanding of being as accurate as possible about that?
Yeah, what a great line of inquiry. As accurate as possible for me personally, there are two things. There is a subjective experience that we can value, right? Even if we want some scientific basis for what we're doing for the purpose of transparency and consent, people's lived experience is always valid. So if somebody says, I did a stretch on my hamstrings and it released this memory, there's no reason for us to try to deny that or take that from
Right.
somebody. From the perspective of someone who is responsible for building a model, right? Then I think we do need some empirical evidence. So for me, when we talk about trauma being in the body, I do think about the neurophysiological system. And there's different ways to think about that, right? The research, what we're focused on is interoceptive theory. And what is that? Basically, interoception, our ability to feel and sense what's happening in our bodies. What's going on in our muscles? A lot of the research is feeling your heartbeat or counting your heartbeat. So muscles, organized tissue of any kind. When we're surviving, chronically surviving under conditions where power is being abused, right? And that's a broad range. We can talk more about that if you want. When survival is a real orientation for us, it does appear through significant amount of research, the parts of our brains that transfer that information, that kind of gather or collect that visceral information, felt stuff from our bodies and bring it up into our central nervous system, into our brains, are dysregulated. So the parts of the brain, like train stations, it's how I'm not a neuroscientist, so just have gotten to work with some. It helps me to think about them as train stops. information from our body, this visceral information, goes through parts of the brain. They're pretty clearly identified now. We'll keep learning more and more. When we've experienced chronic survival, those parts of the way information flows is very unpredictable and dysregulated. Sometimes we get no activity in these key areas of the brain. Sometimes it's overwhelming. How do people describe that? Just like that. I can't feel anything in below my waist. And it's not a neurological thing. Like, let's say that's been ruled out. I feel no sensation in this part of my body, or I feel sensation everywhere and I can't make it stop. It's a very common condition or experience of survival and some oscillation there. For most of us, it's a big swing. It's either it's this all or nothing.
Yeah, numbness, no problem.
Yeah, it's really a dysregulated experience. So for us, for these models, interoceptive theory is right at the center, and we're associating a lot of the suffering with dysregulated interoception. Personally, I think a lot about self-harm, and as a way of trying to manage this, right? People talk about self-harm in often two ways. Either I'm trying to make overwhelming sensations stop, located in one place, or I can't feel anything.
Right.
And I'm trying to create something. Totally understandable, both, right? Like that makes so much sense as a human being. Difficult way to live a life, right? It's a difficult way to live a life. That's all. So part of this work with our embodied practice is, can we use yoga forms as opportunities to kind of flex the muscles of interoception, kind of reorganize our capacity, And, because of neuroplasticity, we know our brains are capable of change. So it makes sense that we would approach it this way, right? Like our brains aren't locked in. We can change the way that they are activated, what's happening in there. So we try to use yoga forms to really exercise our interoceptive skill, if you like.
Okay, so as concisely, accurately, non-metaphorically as possible, yoga forms can be a really good tool for trauma survivors because they're a way to exercise the skill of interoception and self-regulation.
Self-regulation is different.
Yeah.
I think it's different personally. Okay, that's a great. I'm glad that word came up because there's another key word that's out there. I was, for me, right, for this model, we're kind of stopping at the exercising interoception part. Right?
Okay.
Self-regulation is expecting an outcome, right? Like mostly I'm calming myself down. There's a whole framework in trauma that relates to the nervous system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system, in an effort to really activate the parasympathetic nervous system. That's sort of the part of our nervous system that helps us regulate and calm down. Understanding that that system is also impacted. There's a ton of research with trauma and an impacted, dysregulated nervous system. That's valid. For us, we found that trying to get people to calm down became another kind of power struggle, right? So there's an outcome that we have in mind there.
Interesting.
Got to get you to calm down. What if being hyper vigilant is the way I feel safe?
Right. So as soon as I say, hey, calm down, it's like putting a blindfold on in a war zone. That's a terrible idea.
There you go. The question then is, can we do this trauma care, this embodied trauma care, and not require us to calm down? Not make that a requirement, right? Or like a goal or an outcome. And here's where yoga is perfect for me. I think yoga is perfectly attuned to non-attachment to outcomes. That's the whole point in a lot of ways.
Philosophically, there's right in there, right? Like non-grasping. Attachment is right.
Yeah, exactly. So like I feel like that creates a real resonance, a real synchrony between what complex trauma is asking for and what yoga is saying it's available for in that sense.
Let's compare and contrast. So I know trauma sensitive weightlifting's now a thing. We had Laura on who wrote Lifting Heavy Things, which it was a great interview. Really enjoyed her and what she had to say. I know there's a whole course I'm thinking about signing up for. Martial arts, my mentor Paul Linden really led the way in kind of trauma sensitive martial arts. That's a whole thing now. What are some of the sort of pros and cons if we were to compare yoga, martial arts, weightlifting? Like, for example, yoga has that heritage of non-grasping, but it also has the Asian heritage of like top-down gurus.
Yeah.
Martial arts has that same heritage, but it's maybe more relational, for example. But there might be touch, which might be a pro or con. Weightlifting, a lot more goal-orientated, a lot more Western-orientated, but without some of the sort of spiritual baggage. What are your thoughts on like pros and cons of those three?
Yeah, that's real. I think you laid out a lot of interesting like discussion points or inquiries. I'm limited, right? Like I started with trauma sensitive yoga, and that's really where I'm located. As the co-director of the Center for Trauma and Embodiment, we do have a weightlifting program now and a theater program for youth. I'm doing a lot of learning from them, and especially as the research is really picking up. I've noticed in listening and learning from them, let's say weightlifting, one of the benefits, having a third object in the space. So you have the trainer, the coach, right, the trainee, and you get this piece of metal, this heavy thing, or whatever, it could be anything, a band or whatever. Now you're relating to that too. So there's a third object in the space to practice relating to. That's interesting. And I think the interoceptive possibilities are also curious as well, because with yoga, we're really relying on just our own bodies. What's happening here? How do we engage through our own bodies from a sensory perspective? When you have something heavy to lift, you're kind of activating sensation. You're engaging muscles in a different way. You can have more or less weight on there. So that gives you another way to choose. Do I want more of this or less of this? Right? Because it kind of titrate that interoception.
The calibration that's literal, very literal with weight.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's a benefit. I think that's really interesting. I'm really curious to see how that plays out, actually. But to be honest, like I really hesitate to get in there because I don't understand enough. I think I have some understanding about yoga and how it's showing up here, but kind of limited on the other fronts.
I wonder if nothing else, it just attracts different personality types. Like martial arts is full of trauma survivors who have a fight response. Makes
Yeah.
sense, right? Weightlifting's solitary. It doesn't have necessarily, it has a different cultural association. I see way more guys in weightlifting, way more women in yoga, or for whatever reason. So if nothing else, we can kind of scoop up more people as long as there's a bunch of practices. Some people love the theater, the social, performative element. I'm not very performative in other ways, so maybe that's not for me. Like I see how having a selection, a smorgasbord of practices would just, if nothing else, scoop up different personality types.
I love that idea. Yeah, so we can use the word choice again, right?
Yeah.
Like offering choices is such an important trauma-informed approach in general. Yeah, I think that's a great
concern there. Maybe that people might pick from their neurosis, not from their need.
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good point too, right? And we all find different things at different times. Just but they're here is like just based on experience, right? We were talking about talk therapy earlier. For me, there was a time in my life where that was off limits for me. And then, I get older and have different experiences. Now it's on the table and it's super important. So yeah, maybe it's back to that Judith Herman thing. Like what we really do need to do is turn power over to folks seeking care. And yeah, sometimes we're going to make choices that aren't the best. I think we do need to trust people to, and this is holistic, make mistakes. I really think of trauma as a set of conditions that limits our ability to make mistakes. We kind of have to be perfect to survive, more perfect than a normal human. So much is at stake. I think part of the big healing process is being able to make mistakes, and then what comes next?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, for me, a dojo or shala is almost defined as a space where you can make mistakes with limited consequence,
Huh.
as opposed to sort of martial arts in a dojo versus a street fight is a clear example,
Oh yeah.
right? The mistakes are a lot less consequential. So there's a space for learning because you're not having to perform.
Mhm.
Um, I was listening to these interviews with you from like 7 or 8 years ago,
Okay.
and it feels like another time now. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like a lot of the interviews I found for whatever reason were like 7, 8 years old. I was like, cool, learning a lot, all good stuff. It feels like the yoga community is way more sophisticated,
Yeah.
like way
Agreed.
more around trauma. Like even like kids on TikTok are learning about trauma. It's
Yeah.
out there now. It's really out there in a cool way. I knew Ukrainian soldiers who learned loads learned loads from Instagram about trauma, and like 25-year-olds. And the other thing that's changed is the world, right? Like it feels like a more postmodern, crazy, topsy-turvy. America, the final season is going to be really interesting. I'm looking forward to that final season. You remind me of Rick Grimes, by the way, from The Walking Dead a little bit. You look a little bit like Survivor so I'm sticking with you for the zombie apocalypse in November. I kind of like in terms of like this is too much. Let me know. I don't mean to mind that.
Okay.
It's just free forming. But like
Deep
a lot's
breaths
changed since those interviews that I listened to you, right? Like a lot's changed.
for sure. Yeah, I think it is interesting when we're just thinking about politics even. There is a conversation that I think a lot of us have, which is trauma. Trauma, from our perspective, is all about power, right? It's all about abusive power, whether that's a dyadic relationship or a system, and then surviving in the context of that power abuse. Politics is all about power. And we found as time has gone on, let's say even since those 7 or 8 years, I think we used to think all we need to do is keep our heads down, build good models that are smart, they're empirically validated, give them to people in the world. I would say one of the things that's changed for me, for us here, is we actually have to participate in the world too, because that's where these dynamics are playing themselves out all the time. And we actually have something to say about that, from our perspective. So, yeah, we really do want to engage, and we talk about abuses of power when we see them, and
Mhm.
and just naming. I think an invitation for anybody is noticing how power is being used and abused in any context that we're in. Really beginning to discern that, whether it's a dojo, a yoga studio, a political arena. What are people doing with power? Starting to trust ourselves with that, trust our bodies with that information. And what do we want to do about that? How do we respond?
Yeah.
So
Power
that's
is important for trauma for sure. And this sort of French Foucault kind of philosophical obsession with power that is now sort of fully integrated into the American left is certainly one perspective that's worth a look. Um, I'll come out of the closet. I'm pretty right wing, and I work with soldiers and other people who are pretty conservative. And the sort of word on the street I hear is conservative people don't feel welcome around most trauma educators because they feel like it's become very political, and
interesting.
maybe that's not,
Interesting.
they don't feel so welcome. And the other word on the street is I'm just back from teaching in Slovenia, Czechia. Most of the world finds the world leaders in this field to have a sort of American political bias.
Oh
Like
yeah.
the average Slovenian or Czech, I've got a Czech student staying in my house at the moment. Like he just laughs when he hears most American stuff, around the kind of politics, intersectionality. Like it just doesn't make any sense to him. He hasn't colonized anyone. And it's
Yeah.
I wonder if there was a time when there was no politics in trauma, and I used to say, hey, come on, there's politics as a factor here. And
Yeah.
now I wonder if there's too much politics or too much one-sided. I mean, how many right-wing trauma teachers do you know? I know two.
I don't know anybody necessarily who ascribes to a political dogma per se as a trauma teacher, but they could exist. I think it's about power. I think it's how is power being used? What are the conditions created around power? I think that's the thing for us to kind of pay attention to, and I don't know that's necessarily, I don't think it has to be partisan, but I think it sometimes is. I think
Mm,
it, and
mm.
that's outside of us as people. I had a really interesting experience. I work with military folks too, and about 10 years ago, maybe longer, I got to go down to a Marine base here in the United States and spend a couple days with Marines. I was really nervous. I was going down there as a yoga teacher, like how are these people going to accept me in? I gotta say, I found more love there than at most yoga studios.
Lot of love, lot of brotherhood, lot of co-regulation between brothers for sure.
And I was kind of welcomed into that. And it was a very formative experience. I think it wasn't about politics. So that was outside of that scope. It was about people. It was about, hey, what do you have for me? Well, you care enough to come here with something. What do you got? Let me try it. That kind of thing. So I think it was, yeah, I think it's important.
Is there any groups you particularly like working with? Just taking it back to the personal now, like, and for sometimes I find this changes randomly in my own life and things
Yeah.
come and go. Like I'm enjoying working with young men at the moment. I used to work with blah blah blah. Any groups you're particularly kind of drawn to?
I was working with youth for about 17 years, just until a few months ago. And I really enjoy mostly female identifying kids, non-male identifying actually. Really enjoyed that. Though it turned out to be a lot of one-on-one or kind of dyad situations. I thought that was really engaging. But for me, at this point, it's about a lot of mentorship, helping people who are working in all kinds of situations all over the world with all sorts of different people, and ranging from like EMTs in rural America to queer kids in the inner city and in the rural America too, or rural parts of the world anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Personally, how do you handle it? You've been in this game a while, and give me just a few days ago, I was in Slovenia. I was working with a woman from Bosnia, and some stuff came up to do with violation, and we were doing some coaching on boundaries, and it was like deep transpersonal kind of trauma stuff around Bosnian mass atrocities, and I needed half a day to recover. And I'm pretty experienced. I've been to 6 war zones. I've been around the houses, and
Yeah.
I was like, whoa, just holding that Bosnian ship for like, even for like a 20-minute coaching session, I was like, that was intense. And I was glad I had a co-trainer. I said, Ava, you're in charge. I'm going to go walk in the woods. I'll be back in an hour. It's
Yeah.
a lot. All right.
Yeah.
I wonder
Yeah.
how you've done so much of this work without it
Yeah.
just leaving you a kind of broken mess.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think partnership is key, right? Having colleagues, folks who understand, who you can talk to, you can kind of lean on, vice versa. Um, for something like TCTSY, this model, we are we're engaging at the same time. There's a lot of value in that, I think. I feel like the traditional Western medical system that really removes somebody, like you have the expert on the outside and the sick person on the inside. I think that does a lot more harm to the supposed expert than a scenario like this where you're showing up together, and you're actually getting to pay attention to your body and make choices about your body in the moment. I think there's a lot of value in that. I feel like that's been in a way protective for me. But I also mentioned for me, therapy is really key. That's really, really important. And then just relationships in general.
Yeah. Yeah. So you've got the good support network.
Yeah, yeah,
Totally great for me. I also have 2 therapists, a body worker.
yeah,
Like the Help for the Helpers, a very good book I found. It's about Rothschild, I think it is. And like that's not a straightforward thing, is it? I mean, you have to have a whole suite of things to help, I'd say.
yeah. Yeah, and we're all different, right? Like we all need different things, and that's for sure. But some building up some kind of support network around you is key.
Mm, mm. Learning edges, things you're maybe professionally or personally, what's I mean,
Yeah,
20 years, isn't it? You're old school, man. Like you were doing this before it was cool. So
yeah, yeah. Learning edge for me is about, this goes back to our conversation. I know it's a little bit sensitive for us, it seems, but power, being a white man, showing up with lots of people who aren't like me. Trauma knows no boundaries, but it is pooled in areas where are typically oppressed. Poverty, racial dynamics, especially in the United States, but I think that's global too in different ways, tribal dynamics. So what is it like for me to have inherited? You mentioned somebody who said, I've never colonized anybody. right? There's truth there, but we've inherited the mantle of privilege, through these 400 years, let's say, from my case. What is it like to be open to that? To really show up for like being curious about that. What does it mean for somebody who, like a Black queer kid, when I come into the space with some authority? How do I manage that? Am I willing to turn that over, to be engaged, as opposed to kind of like just kind of slide into the system as it's built for me. So I think that's a really important edge.
Really?
I enjoy it, to be
Yeah,
honest
yeah,
with you.
yeah. No, appreciate that. I'm going back to my Czech student who, isn't from a country that's colonized anyone, doesn't have significant minorities in his country in terms of ethnically.
At this moment, yeah.
Yeah, the EU will probably force them to. And the American view of what constitutes privilege doesn't well apply to him. And it would be a kind of intellectual colonization to make my young Czech student think like someone in New York.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can talk about that as folks. But don't you think that power gets abused and hoarded in certain spaces in any country, or kind of like a collection of people, and that there are other people that are sort of forced to manage that hoarding of power? I think Europe has had a pretty strong experience with that over the past 100 years, right? And so
Yeah,
many
my
different.
family are Irish, so I've kind of got two sides of that in my own system. The English
Same. I'm
and
Irish too.
Irish, the original colony. It's where simplicities of skin color just don't make sense to me because I work in
Yeah.
Ukraine and with Jewish people and with Irish people, and it's like the simplicities of skin color. To me, the kind of power that matters most and almost exclusively is money. I've got a lot of sympathy for sort of old school socialists,
Yeah.
kind of union socialists who basically say, there are black gay people in the ruling, the Conservative Party that just got thrown out of the UK, which is our right-wing
Yep.
party.
Yep.
For me, like money is the key factor and everything else is a distraction.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a factor, but there's so many complicated systems that we're involved in, right? Like, where does money get pooled? Who's had access to resources for the past 300 years and who hasn't? In most of the world, who was doing the colonizing, who was exploiting the resources. And the fact that money is pooled there is not just a fluke. Are there exceptions? Are there Oprah Winfrey's? Of course.
Right, but the reason money gets pulled isn't just because of power. Like that's one. If let's
Yeah.
just take a minor example, if I see someone who's rich, it could be from talent, hard work, or corruption and power. It could be from any of those three. And the
You wouldn't,
conservatives only emphasize hard work, and the liberals only emphasize corruption and power, and they're both half right, I would say.
I agree. I agree. I think there's middle space there. I think there's middle space. I'm suggesting, especially as trauma care, people who
Mm.
aspire to be trauma stewards, that would be really critical about that. Like, let's not be simplistic, but let's be able to examine like how these systems are how they are real, how they have been replicated, how we are capable of chipping away and changing, so there's much more openness and parity. But yeah, I think I agree with you that simple response doesn't do anybody any good. Dogma in any way is not going to help anybody. But
Yeah.
being
So
open and critical, I think, is what I'm kind of
open
advocating.
and critical makes sense to me. And, the Czech Republic, for example, was oppressed by the Soviets, and they're
Yeah,
both
exactly,
right?
exactly.
And that was a pretty heavy
Exactly.
repression. So that's not a simplicity. It might not, it might be a nuance that's lost on someone from
Yeah,
another culture who doesn't know that history.
yeah,
Good.
yeah.
I don't want to end with that because actually, in some ways, I really have enjoyed the fact that we can dialogue here and I
Same.
value civility. And let's just say there's been other guests who have failed to have a real dialogue. And I got the sense they weren't listening as opposed to I get the sense you are. So I just appreciate that personally. Thank
Same.
you.
I do too.
I think the world needs more of that. We need more of that in the world, not shouting at each other.
If we can have these conversations, honestly, as people who are showing up to be trauma care providers, I think it's incredibly important. I do value it too.
Let's finish with joy and then where to find you. So, what are the biggest sources of joy? Because people listening to this, they're probably thinking about trauma and politics. And like I'd say, listening to this, shake it off, take a breath, feel your body,
Yeah.
do what you need to resource yourself after this conversation. So let's
Awesome.
talk a little bit about joy before we wrap up.
Great question. Yeah, for me, it's music. It's always been music. Music saved my life as a kid. And I still love it. I go into big concerts, being around thousands of people, singing the songs together. That's, I would say, like a centerpiece. And my family, my son is now 23, and being able to be with him and in a way that is challenging me in the best of ways to show up as fully as I can. I'm so grateful. I love it.
It's funny, like music, like my Italian girlfriend would probably add food, family. These
And
are
wine.
non-political universals that we all love,
Yeah.
right? Things we
Yeah.
can all go. Someone from Iraq might like a different music, but we still both like music. He might
Yeah.
like
We
a
can feel it.
spicy food, but we still would probably actually enjoy each other's food. There's a universality in that.
100%. Yeah. Yeah.
Beautiful, Dave. This has been great. Really enjoyed it. You've got a few websites, right? Where's the best place for people to go who are yoga teachers, who are just civilians? What do you recommend?
I would say probably heal with CFTE.org. You can get to the yoga program there, weightlifting, or the theater program from there. So
Nice
I
one.
would say that's the key.
Yeah,
Uh,
here with CFTE. That's Charlie Foxtrot Tango
that's it.
Echo.org.
That's it.
Great. David, thank you so much for joining us.
Appreciate it, Mark. Nice talking with you.